So is Daken and Destroy gonna take over the meta? Is Lady Deathstrike the worst card ever in Marvel Snap? Well, we're gonna answer those questions and more in this video. This is our card review for the August 2023 season of cards. They just got formally revealed, so these should be the final versions of these cards. I'm gonna talk through how I think these might fit into the meta, what kind of decks they might be in, how strong I think they're going to feel, and then finally give each of them a star rating from 1 to 4 stars at the end of the video. So let's kick it off here with the new season pass card, and it is Daken. This is apparently Wolverine's kid, and he's got some cool hair. If you guys get me to 1 million subs, I'll do my hair like that. He's a 3/4 with on reveal, add the Muramasa Shard to your hand. The Muramasa Shard is a 1/1, and it reads, when this is discarded or destroyed, you double Daken's power. So that would push him to a 3/8, which is clearly really good. A 3/8 is a fantastic stat line for a 3-cost card. That is far above the normal rate. This kind of puts him in a similar space as something like Thor. We've got a 3/4 to base, and then you need to make some additional plays to continue scaling it up. Now, the big difference with Thor is that that is put into your deck with Mjolnir, which means you have to do a little bit of work to find it, and there's often also some opportunity cost because you had to draw the Mjolnir instead of another real card that you might have been able to play. Clearly, decks are constructed around that with things like Lockjaw or Jane Foster, Lady Thor, to help you reduce that opportunity cost and make sure you have plenty of activations for your Mjolnir. But with Daken, it's just going right to hand, so you're not going to have to deal with finding it as long as you have ways to either discard it reliably or just use it as some destroy fodder. Then it's going to be really easy to pull that off. But it does come with a cost of 1 energy instead of 0 for Mjolnir, which is an important consideration if you're looking to play this, for instance, in a destroy deck. Now, I don't think that's a huge cost. It's pretty easy to flex in 1 power in something like a destroy deck, and it's going to serve dual purposes because it's not only going to buff Daken, but might be something you feed into your Carnage or use to discount your death. The power might get added back into Null, even though that's a tiny amount. It still all adds up, right? So you're getting something out of that 1 energy extra expenditure. You could in some ways look at this as a 4/8, but in reality I think it's going to be more like a 4/10, a 4/11 in total power output if you're playing the Muramasa Shard. Now, that said, there's a whole other angle of this, which is discard, which does not require you to play the Muramasa Shard, and I think actually will be really easy to work with things like Colleen Wing in particular. That's a fantastic way to just get rid of your Muramasa Shard, an easy +4 on Daken, and Colleen Wing's a great card to play anyway. She's above rate as a 2/4 already, so that just fits in perfectly. A really efficient play altogether. And there's also stuff like MODOK. If you don't have a good way to discard the shard early on, just use your big MODOK and discard everything anyway. The shard's going to be a part of that. Then you get that nice 8-power MODOK, +4 on Daken. You've already got a couple nice threats. You got a Morbius in there. That comes together. You've got a really nice curve in particular here with Daken. They also tease some ideas in the season pass video with things like Moon Girl. You could get multiple copies of the Muramasa Shard and then double Daken multiple times, pushing him from 8 to 16, for instance, if you were able to discard 2 of these. I think personally that sounds a little bit too sneaky. In other words, that probably requires a little too much setup. That feels inconsistent. Sometimes it's hard to get the right cards in hand, particularly those added to the right side of your hand with something like Muramasa Shard for Moon Girl. So I don't think that'll be the angle to go for this. I think 8 power is going to feel like enough for Daken in many cases. Occasionally, there might be some other ways to buff this preemptively. Locations can buff this, etc. So you'll see higher numbers from time to time, but I think you'll be happy with 8. I don't think you have to go crazy to make this one feel good when the game plan is already feeding into your plan regardless. That's what you want to be doing. You want to be destroying things. You want to be discarding things. It's not work for you in those decks. It's actually a bonus. It's complementary to your game plan. So 3/8 in that case will feel really nice as another angle of attack. So you might have that Morbius, the Daken, the MODOK, or the Apocalypse, or the Dracula, and you have kind of this perfect split across areas with big power contributing cards in each area, so you're not weak in any particular spot. Now, I almost wonder if Destroy is going to have a harder time with the Daken and the Muramasa Shard in this case. Number one, that extra energy expenditure you have to spend on the shard's a little tough, but also I think from a curve standpoint, like a discard deck has probably a little more space on turn 3 because of the curve we've talked about, Morbius, Daken, Dracula, MODOK, is kind of perfect. This is not as maybe easy to weave into a destroy deck. You're often looking to play Deathlocks and Venoms and these sorts of things that are a little more expensive, and you need a more sequential series of plays in a destroy deck. You have to line up the things to destroy first. Does Daken get in the way? Is he kind of awkward sometimes? I think he's still going to be fine. I think it's probably going to be worth it to have another high power card in there early, but perhaps just a little more awkward. I could imagine some cuts actually, some decks actually cutting Daken in the destroy world just because he feels a little clunky to get moving and get into play, and particularly if you draw him too late, he's just kind of a 3/4. It might be hard to get the shard down in a timely fashion. So to me, it makes a little more sense to discard, but still a high power, high efficiency card in many cases that I think will feel like a really good fit for at least 2 different decks. Discard's going to get a stronger bonus, I think, but still good in both. So moving on here, let's talk about Silver Samurai. This is another discard angle card here. He is a 4/5, and he's got on reveal, each player discards the lowest power card from their hand. And obviously, that can feed really nicely into your Muramasa Shard. You play Daken on 3, Silver Samurai on 4, you're cooking. That's actually a pretty nice little sequence. And Silver Samurai actually has a fantastic on reveal here because it is not the lowest cost card from your opponent's hand. That's what we've seen before with things like Stature and Black Bolt's the one who discounts it, but the Stature Black Bolt deck, Black Bolt discards the lowest cost card, which often hits something fairly small or inconsequential in your opponent's hand. Some little, 2-drop or something they've kind of been sitting on that just didn't find time to get played. It's not hitting big win conditions. It's not hitting super high powered cards. Silver Samurai, on the other hand, actually has a chance to hit some really prime targets that are 0 cost. Things like your Iron Mans, your Arnim Zolas, your Cerebros, even a Patriot or something could get caught by Silver Samurai because it is the lowest power card. And you're not sacrificing much. 4/5 is a stat line that we know that is proven and makes sense. So we could see this almost in like a Zabu control deck of sorts, where you've just got like a Zabu on 2, a Daken on 3, a Silver Samurai on 4. Doesn't necessarily have to be in a discard deck specifically. I could see that Black Bolt Stature deck, that shell, it was very good at the top of the meta for a while. Still actually a pretty decent deck today as well. Maybe running something like Silver Samurai, either in addition to Black Bolt or perhaps instead of Black Bolt, could be fantastic. You could counter a lot of decks that way, still do something like enable that 1/7 Stature, which is a very powerful card when it's costing 1, obviously. So some kind of Zabu tempo shell deck here for Silver Samurai, not specifically discard. Does it work in discard? Yeah, probably actually still good in discard because of the Muramasa Shard. Maybe you could line this up for Wolverines or Swarms. Clearly there are some angles there, but I actually think this card is maybe more interesting and more threatening in that kind of tempo opponent discard shell. Offers some control utility, some real counters there, and still enable some of your own power plays with things like that Stature. But you could also run Swarms or Muramasa Shards to kind of double down, hurting your opponent and benefiting yourself as well. So I actually think this card looks insane. We know Zabu is so flexible with so many 4-drops. This is a 3/5. It's ridiculous. This is a card you don't want to play on 6 necessarily in a Zabu deck, which sometimes having those multiple 4s that cost 3 on turn 6, a 3 and a 3, is a really powerful line. This is probably less useful in that case, but if you're running the Muramasa Shard, could still actually be a value surprise power add late in a game. So to me, I actually think this card looks really good and really strong, and again, fits into a couple different decks, which always helps. If a card has multiple angles that it can get played in, that just increases the likelihood that it's a useful and valuable sort of card. So moving on here, it's X23, and yeah, this card's really cool. She is a 1/2, and she reads, when this is discarded or destroyed, regenerate it at a random location and you get +1 energy next turn. So this is like the ultimate destroy fodder card. You play this down, you're happy to eat this. It's a fantastic card to eat. Whereas something like Wolverine, you're really happy to eat because it keeps getting bigger over time. This you're happy to eat because it advances your energy, allowing you to actually ramp in a destroy deck, which I think is surprisingly good. Not only is that, nice in the mid game, sometimes just allowing you to get like, 4 energy instead of 3. So like play this on 1, Carnage on 2, you've got 4 energy instead of 3. That can help because now you can like weave in another 1-cost card alongside your Venom or Deathlock or whatever it is. And it helps you just push more stuff into the destroy engine as you're going. Now that may require a little bit of deck adjustments to make sure all the energy costs line up and you're able to properly utilize all of that extra energy. But I don't actually think it's most valuable in the mid game. I think it's most valuable because this lets you get down something like Null on turn 5. So if you eat X23 on turn 4, you go into turn 5 with 6 energy. And there are some really spicy things you can do when Null comes down into a game early, because then you can do things like Arnim Zola your Null, which is insane because you destroy that Null. The power that you've destroyed feeds into the new 2 Nulls, and that can be absolutely nutty. I mean, somewhat easily counterable in some cases, right? But depending on priority, etc., that can be a really big win condition. And the good news with a play like that is you haven't really sacrificed much in order to set it up. You've been happy to do it because your X23 is actually feeding into your tempo really nicely. You're still playing Carnages and Bucky Barnes and Venoms and all this stuff that is getting you power in play. It's not like you're passing your early turns like a ramp deck traditionally would. Those decks are playing something like Electro and then catching up late. A destroy ramp deck with X23 is putting power in play early. They're getting stats down, and then they still have these crazy late game plays, perhaps playing multiple 6-drops like we talked about. So to me, I think this actually just feeds really well into so many of the different things that Destroy is looking to do. And then I haven't even talked about this card for discard. I don't think it's going to open up quite as many crazy lines for discard as it would for Destroy. For instance, you know, if this isn't like your MODOK on turn 5, having that extra energy on turn 6 is probably not useful because you have like a fixed 6-cost hand of like Apocalypse and some Swarms or whatever. So that might be a little less useful, minus, you know, random Sunspot, I guess, that does show up sometimes in discard, that 1 extra power there. But as an early feed for, you know, your Colleen Wings or whatever it might be, that's not bad. A little extra energy flexibility can be useful. That can certainly be nice. You know, get down a Dracula a little earlier, that sort of thing can help fix some gaps in the curve and might feel like a fairly free addition to a discard deck. So this doesn't feel like some crazy new enabler to me that drives discard in a new direction, but feels like a good fit, I guess, which that means this card looks to me really insane in Destroy, solid in discard. Again, that's a recipe for a card that gets played a lot. Our next and final card here is Lady Deathstrike. And I do love the character. This is the most recognizable character this month for me. I mean, I do Silver Samurai. I am familiar with X23. I have no clue who Daken is. This dude is totally new to me. But Lady Deathstrike, I definitely am familiar with. I remember her pretty well. But anyway, she's a 5/3, and she reads, on reveal, destroy each card here with less power than this. So this is a really interesting effect, right? We need to talk about this and its applications, because there's a couple different ways to approach the utility of this card, right? Number one, let's look at it at a base level as a 5/3, outside of any sort of power manipulations or increases. This is a card that you can play down, and it's symmetrical, right? It affects both your opponent and you. So, you know, for instance, if you play this in a lane with X23, it's going to destroy your X23, yay. And it's also going to destroy anything on your opponent's side that has 2 power or less. It's not equal to or less with a 3. It's got to be less than, so it's got to be 2 or less. So she might clean up some like small 1-drops, little stuff, Icemans or whatever that have been tossed in. I mean, theoretically, a C2 deck could be ruined by this if they've yet to play Cerebro, that sort of thing. And then, of course, there are some prime 0 power targets, like we talked about with Silver Samurai. You know, there are the Ironmans of the world, the Cerebros of the world. A card I've seen bandied about with this in particular, this conversation, is Dracula. Like, hey, we finally have a Dracula counter, and that's going to make Lady Deathstrike amazing because I can finally kill my Dracula. So let's just address that real quick. Dracula right now is in, last I looked, it was like 4.5% of the meta, but we'll double check to get the most updated numbers. Yeah, okay. So Dracula right now is in 3.1% of decks. So if you're running Lady Deathstrike as a counter to Dracula, It's bad 97% of the time that you play. In 3% of games, it's going to kill that Dragula. That's not a reason, in other words, to love Lady Deathstrike. Cards like Iron Man, Cerebro, etc. are perhaps slightly advantageous for something like Lady Deathstrike. But importantly for those are really easily answered already by something like Enchantress, which is just a more efficient power play at a base, costs less, plays into Zabu, etc. So, in other words, if you're using Lady Deathstrike offensively to try to destroy your opponent's stuff, that is, you know, those high value, low power sorts of targets, it's probably not as likely to succeed, number one, or as useful as other counter cards that exist in the meta already as an offensive card. So to be worth it, you have to net enough upside on your own stuff. So you need it to be doubly impactful to net enough upside on this card. But I would argue that it's still not very good in that case, because if you're running this in a destroy deck with things to destroy, you already have so many super efficient ways to destroy things that scale power up really effectively. You know, you want that Carnage getting bigger. You want that. It's going to be like 8 power instead of Lady Deathstrike that's 3. So in other words, I'm saying there are so few scenarios and board states and game states where Lady Deathstrike lines up this like perfectly, you know, doubly effective destroy, where she eats your opponent's Iron Man and she eats your Bucky Barnes, and you've made this awesome play. It's just not that likely to line up all that often. And frankly, if it were to become a part of the meta in that regard, people would play around it. They wouldn't play an Iron Man in your Bucky Barnes lane. You know what I mean? They would just avoid the scenario where Lady Deathstrike gets to hit both sides effectively. So to me, it is this like super situational, super contextual effect that is going to fail and feel bad far more often than it actually succeeds. So the other side of Lady Deathstrike we can talk about is increasing her power. In the reveal video, we saw, you know, they had pushed her up to like 6, or I think it was like 11 power or something, I forget. But basically they had fed into buffing Lady Deathstrike. They'd played like Wong and Shuri and then Lady Deathstrike. And they made her really big, right? And there are even some like dream scenarios, if you could really concoct it, where you play like Wong and then Shuri and then Deathstrike and then like Artem Zola or something, and it hits the Lady Deathstrike and you try to wipe out every spot on board. But number one, that's like a weird combo that requires, again, perfect sequential play, hitting every card in exactly the right sequence. Shuri alone only pushes this to 6 power, which still doesn't kill the threats that you care about. It doesn't kill the big stuff. Your opponent's playing big Darkhawks. They're playing big things, you know, big 5/8 legions and stuff. And it's so unlikely that Lady Deathstrike is actually able to kill the things you care about. And then you've probably, for the most part, kind of passed 2 turns. You played a really low power Shuri, and then you play a 6 power Lady Deathstrike. Maybe if it's perfect, it's like 12 power, right? You haven't done much with all of this setup. You spent 3 turns to play a single 12 power card that maybe destroys one thing of your opponent's. And then if you do get it big enough to destroy that one thing, you've actually overcommitted. You could have probably just played, you know, a Shang-Chi or some other just bigger card and still won. You still could have flipped that location in your favor, but without committing, you know, 3 turns and all of this power to do it. In other words, to make it good, you have to kind of go all in on it. And then by the time you've gone all in on it, it's no longer good. You've committed too much energy and dedication to it. So that angle of like buffing this up a bunch doesn't make sense for me either. I mean, I think, you know, hand buff sort of effects are slightly better with this. If you can, you know, buff it in deck with Okoye and Nakia or whatever, you know, that feels a little better because you don't have to commit on board to it or commit energy as directly to it, but still clunky. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, dude, you just told us, Regis, that you liked Silver Samurai because it discarded my opponent's 0 power cards, but you don't like Lady Deathstrike for destroying my opponent's 0 power cards. What's the deal? Well, that's a great question. And it's all in the numbers, right? Lady Deathstrike is a 5/3, expensive, low power. Silver Samurai is a 4/5, cheaper, higher power, feels good to play in Zabu decks, probably often 3 energy anyway. And it always does something, even if you know, you don't hit an Iron Man or Arnim Zola or whatever key target you're looking for, you still remove a resource from your opponent's hand. You might mess up something they're going to flex in their final turn. Just a random one-drop being gone can still be useful, and it's still hopefully empowering, you know, your stature upside, your discard upside, or whatever. You don't know if Lady Deathstrike is going to have targets. You don't know if this is going to be good. It's going to sit and it's going to fail. So in a lot of ways, these cards kind of address the same sorts of problems, removing low power, high value threats. But I think Silver Samurai does so in a more interesting way, at a higher base power and at a lower cost, while still offering symmetrical benefits. Lady Deathstrike offers symmetrical benefits, but far more conditionally, far more likely to fail. And if that card doesn't exist in a given matchup, this card's probably pretty useless, whereas Silver Samurai still feels okay to tempo out. So they do actually feel pretty significantly different in that case. So in summary, yes, there are very specific scenarios where you can concoct in your brain that Lady Deathstrike would be useful. I think there are far more scenarios, endless scenarios, where she's going to feel really awkward to play, and it feels like you spent a ton of energy to not really do much or particularly advance your game plan. And having a tech card of sorts that's so good and so limited a fashion that you can't play for tempo. Like, sometimes I'm really happy to play a 4/5 Enchantress. I just need a play. Okay, I'll play a 4/5 Enchantress. I'm not happy to play a 5/3 Lady Deathstrike. I have to have a really good scenario for it to work well. I think those are going to be so few and far between, unless the meta shifts in some really dramatic way, or there are a bunch of new 0 power cards we can't imagine, or some kind of surprise enabler for this. I just don't see this card getting there. To me, it looks far too clunky, far too awkward, far too conditional, and I do think this is a really bad card. Not the worst card ever in Marvel Snap, as I teased at the beginning of the video. That's obviously a bit of hyperbole, but not very good. I actually think this card's pretty bad, in fact. I don't think this will get much play at all. I hope I'm wrong. Cool character. I'd hate to waste a really awesome, iconic Wolverine villain on a bad card. So hopefully this one gets there. Hopefully it's better than I think, but I am not hopeful. So now let's do our quick reviews where I rate each of these cards from 1 to 4 stars. Daken is a 4-star card. Silver Samurai is a 4-star card. X-23 is a 4-star card. Lady Deathstrike is a 1-star card. And there you go. That wraps it up for this month's card review. Ultimately, I think a lot of strong cards here. I think Destroy decks look to be gaining a nice bonus, but I actually think you might be surprised by discard decks getting even better than Destroy decks. And I think particularly some kind of stature tempo Silver Samurai thing, I would keep an eye on that. Zabu is already a great card, empowering so much at the top of the meta. Silver Samurai fits in easily. Wouldn't be hard to put a stature in there. We might see a fusing of that kind of stature Black Bolt and Zabu Darkhawk shells, which they already kind of cross over quite a bit, but we might see even more with Silver Samurai as some kind of linchpin here. That could be a top new deck. Just keep that in the back of your mind. So anyway, good stuff. Great month to invest in some Spotlight caches, I think, probably. But stay tuned. We'll, of course, play all these decks in videos as soon as they come out. So look forward to that. Thanks much, as always, for watching. Share your thoughts on these cards down below. And until next time, game on.